bill as it relates to the universal access to early learning. And so any budget questions we can have at that time. And without further ado, first we have state library systems, followed by OEL, then Hawaii Teacher Standards Board, charter schools, and then the Department of Education. So without further ado, we'll start out with state libraries. Thank you.
Aloha, Chair Woodson and Vice Chair Capella. Thank you so much to you and the committee for giving us an opportunity to talk about the library and the budget this year. If it's okay, I'm going to share my screen for a brief presentation. Hopefully you all can see my screen.
We can see it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm Stacy Aldridge. I'm the state librarian, and with me I have my colleague, the assistant to the state librarian, Mallory Fujitani. And again, we thank you for the opportunity to talk about our budget. Considering you are the education committee, we thought we would share this math problem of 2020, which is a good expression of the difficulties that we were all facing this year when we were looking at what 2020 would be. And the math problem basically is, if you're going down a river at 3 miles per hour and your canoe loses a wheel, how much pancake mix would it take to shingle a roof? I think for many of our organizations, we have been feeling this. Our staff have had to adapt very quickly. We've had to look at the way we do things. We've had to look at how to be safe. And I'm very appreciative to all our staff for their flexibility. When the pandemic happened, we focused immediately. If we couldn't be open physically, we focused on our digital public doors to make sure they were open. We provided more ebooks. We worked with the schools to connect to Sora, which is the app that connects to ebooks for schools. But that same company that does ebooks is the same company we use. So we were able to also connect our ebooks through that same app to make it very easy for students. We created an online library card application so people could, if they didn't have a library card, could apply for a card and immediately use all the digital resources that we had. Our staff learned how to do virtual programming, and we have our librarians who did virtual story times to connect with their favorite users who would normally come in for a story time. And we also had special guests come and do online presentations and invite the public. We had authors, and we had a famous librarian, Nancy Pearl, come and talk with the public. We added additional services like Canopy, which are streaming movies, and we added more additional educational opportunities for families and for teachers in Scholastics Teachables, which is over 30,000 worksheets related from K through 8th grade on every topic that you can think of. And it's really great for students who may have issues or challenges with math. You can find specific worksheets to help them practice. Since we launched that service in August, we've had over 19,000 courses download, like the sheets, these worksheets downloaded. So it's pretty exciting that it's been well received. And the statistics continue to prove that our libraries were needed more than ever and continue to be needed. This year, we hit 1 million circulations of our ebooks. And we were one of 65 libraries in the country that hit 1 million circulations of ebooks. These were our top 3 titles: Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Me and White Supremacy, and Crazy Rich Asians. We think that Harry Potter and the second book in the top 3, Me and White Supremacy, were high at the top because they actually were unlimited access. So it shows that people were really reading the books that were important for the news of the day. And Crazy Rich Asians is just still continuously very popular, especially with the movie. And when you look at the data for Canopy, Canopy provides documentaries, award-winning movies, and learning opportunities and children's programming that's educational. We had over 148,000 users just since July of this year. And it was really, it's hard to compare the data from when we had it during the pandemic because it was unlimited access, which we really appreciated from Canopy, and it was very well used. But since July, we've again had 148,000 users, 31,000 titles have been viewed, and for great courses, there's been 138,000 downloads. And just for your interest, the most watched video right now is Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus, which tells us that we know that this is a popular program that is supporting families. But it wasn't just our digital doors that were important, it was also our people. We had our phone reference open. The Hawaii State Library continued to provide phone services, one-on-one support for the public. And from just March to May, we answered over 8,000 questions. Normally in a total fiscal year, just with e-reference, where people type in a question, it's 3,933 questions. So you can see that people really were looking to talk to another human being. And as soon as we could open to the public to provide services safely, in May, we launched our library takeout service where people could place an order for a book online and then make a reservation once the book, they were informed the book was available, make a reservation online to pick up those books. We've had over 107,000 appointments for pickup since May of 2020 across the state. And numerous people have told us how invaluable the library has been in keeping them sane and making sure that their families had things to read and things to watch and things to just be normal and connect with the stories of our communities. We also play a key role in digital equity. We're a part of the broadband Hui and focus particularly on digital literacy, but our libraries are the places that people connect. In some of locations across our state, people still don't have anywhere else to connect but the state or one of our state public libraries. And so we are that place. We're in the process of improving that network to ensure that we can continue to provide those services by leveraging federal E-rate funds. And we've been working to partner with Workforce Development Council and also University of Hawaii with telehealth. So with Workforce Development being a location that people can come and learn digital skill sets by having connectivity and having someone who can help them begin. And then working with the University of Hawaii on a grant, we're one of the partners for an FCC grant to bring hotspots, but also to have places where people can connect to their care providers if they have high risk conditions. So we can make sure people are connected and people are healthy. So it's been virtual and it's been physical, and we continue to do all of these things, and we look into next year and what people are going to need. And the challenge for us is going to be ensuring that there's equitable access for everyone across all of our islands. The proposed budget is $33,578,267 for 2022. The special funds, $4 million is just what our authority is to spend special funds. It's not actually how much we have in our special funds. And the federal funds is also authority to spend. Our federal dollars are Library Service and Technology Act funds, and those we get one grant that's good for 2 years every year, so we have overlapping grants. When we look at the $33 million that, and we understand the challenges with budgets for everyone this year, that budget has to support 51 branches across the state, and 80% of that budget is for people, and 20% of the budget, 80% of our budget is people and 20% is operations. When we look at the 33 million, we also have to take into additional thought the ongoing restrictions that are usually put every year by the governor's office of 5 to 10%, which brings us probably down to about 30 million to run, again, 51 branches and also our support staff across the state. It means less security, it means less staff, it means less ability to care for our spaces. It makes concern for us on whether or not we're going to be able to leverage the federal dollars that we're bringing in to help support access. And especially the staffing is a concern for us. The libraries, to keep them open to the public, to make sure that people have services, need to have bodies. We are very grateful to the legislature for not removing the 69 positions last year, that they're just unfunded. But now we're up to 114 staff that are vacant. And we're trying to fill a few of the very most crucial positions that are leadership positions to keep our libraries open. But we still need bodies to keep them open. And with people continuing to leave and with less dollars and with hiring freezes, it makes it very difficult for us to have the staff that we need to make sure that those libraries are open everywhere. And I have a concern about our rural communities in particular. Our staffing, what these past two budget cycles have shown us is we were already on running thin But now we have less opportunity to provide substitutes or to provide student helpers to help keep those libraries open. So for example, on the Big Island, we have staff that are sometimes two or three people. If one person is sick and the other person is unavailable, we can't shift people. So what I am concerned about is making sure that even if you're in a smaller community, you still have access to the same resources, especially during this time when everybody's going to be trying to recover from the pandemic. So those are the real issues for us, and we're concerned about our special funds. We've heard some conversation about looking at the special funds for all of the departments. Our special funds are for our collections. If our special funds are taken, we will have 0 funds for collections. So it's a huge challenge for everybody, and we're doing the best we can, but we're very concerned about that equitable access and making sure we have enough just to keep our libraries open to the public. We also have a request for CIP funding, and I'm going to turn that over to my colleague Mallory to discuss a little bit about our CIP request.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon. We just wanted to thank the legislature for supporting our CIP funding requests each year. We usually ask for funding of our lump sum health and safety line item. The lump sum helps us to ensure that projects that were started in previous budget cycles will be able to be completed, and that we have enough funding to do what we need to do. So a lot of times when we something will trigger us to do a major repair, such as replacing the entire AC system. If we're going to close down the library, we'd like to have the funding available to do other repair work, renovation work that also requires libraries to be closed down, so that we can, basically do double duty and ensure that when we reopen, the community has a fresher, newer space. A lot of times we don't have the luxury of completely redoing the library space, but we try to do what we can that makes the most impact and will allow us to have a comfortable space for the community going forward. So we thank the legislature. This year in the governor's budget, he has included $5 million for each of the next 2 fiscal years. In the current biennium budget, we had 10 million and 5 million, so a total of 15 in the current biennium budget. But we appreciate any funding the legislature would provide for us. And right now we have, with our prior appropriations, we have over 20 CIP projects that we're working on. So we do make use of it, and we try our best to not lapse anything. So thank you.
Thank you, Mallory. And I just want to thank Mallory. She has been doing the job of 12 people, and taking on our libraries is a lot of work. So thank you, Mallory. So for us, as we look at the budget this year, our focus again is on equitable access. As public libraries, we're in a unique position to serve rural and urban communities, and we need to be different things to different communities, but we continue to want to be that hub that connects everyone. When one of our community members thought that we were going to lose, they were going to lose their library after all of the staff retired at the end of last year, the patron wrote to us, "Please keep our library open. It's the only community resource here in the local community for the adults, children, and elderly. Most of us in this country community do not have internet access, can't afford books for our kids to read, and don't have reliable transportation to travel to the next available libraries that are more than 20 miles away. We must ensure that we have equitable access in all of our communities as we're all trying to recover from the pandemic. We want to make sure that our Keiki, Makua, and our Kapuna can be successful by having access to all the resources for whatever it is that they need to accomplish, whatever skill they need to build up, whatever access they just need to connect to the world. We must continue to be the educational resource, the poor man's university, as many would call it in the past. Our libraries need your support, and we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Members, are there any questions for state libraries? Any questions? So just a quick question. Thank you again for being here. What are some of the more broader overarching impacts to the library systems? Can you speak about, like, as an example, any types of closures, library closures, different ways in which your system is going to be impacted per the $3 million reduction?
So for the challenge again with our budget is it's 80% people and 20% operations. So actually closing physical locations doesn't really save us much money. It's the bodies that keep the libraries open. So what we are already starting to notice is we have a few libraries that are in very rural locations that are closed more frequently now because we don't have all the positions filled, or because we just don't have enough staff and we can't move people over. For the library that was the quote came from, that's Lapahoehoe on Big Island, and all 3 staff retired at once. And so we're currently, we have the branch manager from Honoka'a, who is managing 2 branches to keep that library open until we can try to figure out how to hopefully be able to fill those positions. So our concern is with the cuts as big as they are, we won't have the funding to replace some of those vacancies that are just actually keeping those libraries open. So I think what we'll see first in the first round, it would be that there would be fewer days or fewer hours available to the public in certain locations. And that is of concern to us.
All right, thank you so much. We have a question from Majority Leader Bellotti.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, State Librarian, for being here. 2 questions, and I'll be real quick. You mentioned that there are 114 vacant positions. Are you subject to the hiring freeze so that you're not able to fill those vacancies? And then what can be done to, we don't want you to obviously run out and fill vacancies, but if it's resulting in closing down libraries, what's the process to make sure that you have those vacancies timely filled? And then second question, I know that the libraries have been very critical in becoming hotspots for our communities. So if you can briefly touch on the E-rate program, is it that you folks participate in, and what is the budgetary match that we need to do with that? Or is that all being funded currently by federal funds or by anything else, or do we need to shore that up?
Okay. So I will try to answer as quickly as I can on both. Thank you very much for both of those questions. The first on the vacancies, we are subject to the hiring freeze. 69 of those 114 we don't have the funding for. So those are already off the table. In 2020, 46 people left. So we have a lot of people who are retiring now or moving on, or we had people during the pandemic who returned to the mainland. So the hiring freeze is an issue, but having less funding to, even as we keep seeing more cuts, that cuts into the amount of money we have for the position. So we're being very strategic. We have been asking for exemptions on our the hiring freeze. So we just received approval to fill our 5 regional libraries that are vacant right now, and our IT, the person who would oversee our IT. I've been overseeing IT for the past year. Looking forward to having someone who can work with us to oversee IT. And we also have a data position that reports our data to the federal government, and there's several other reports. So we can get, we can ask for, and we did finally get approval for some positions, but we have to be really, we're being very strategic in which positions and how much they cost to try to figure out which ones we can fill. And we're trying to place the ones or ask for permission to fill in those areas where we think we might still have the money to fill to just keep the libraries open. With E-rate, so the E-rate program is a federal program that supports schools and libraries. And I noticed Brooke was on this call, and I want to thank you, Brooke, because he helped us. He helped the libraries get started down the road to ask for E-rate. So thank you. So E-rate allows us provide support for internet connectivity and also for equipment for schools and libraries. We did apply and we did receive support for funding to replace all of our equipment in all of our branches and to upgrade connectivity in all of our branches. And The match for us is about 3.2 million that the federal government will give to us to support these upgrades to our connectivity and also to our equipment. And the match is about, I think, $820,000. We tried to park some money in our budget, holding on to that money, knowing that we might have a repair or something that comes up, but we've tried to park a little bit of money to meet that match. And we also are working with the Friends of the Library of Hawaii to get a grant to support the other remaining part of the match. But we really hope that even if we don't get the grant, we really want to find the funds to make sure that we can update all of our technologies to make sure we have the best access and take full advantage of such a small amount of money when you think about it to leverage $3.2 million. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Majority Leader. Thank you so much. Members, any other questions? Okay, seeing none, we're going to let libraries go. Thank you for joining us, and we will move on to the Executive Office of Early Learning. Thank you.
Thank you. May I request that Jordana Ferreira be allowed to share her screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Woodson, Vice Chair Capella, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to present to you. Joining me this afternoon are Jordana Ferreira, EOEL's Government Affairs Specialist, and Colleen Momohara, Educational Specialist for our Public Pre-Kindergarten Program. As requested, I'd like to share with you our journey, the journey our agency has taken over the last year. The challenges and successes that we've seen and experienced have directly informed our budget requests. When the state legislature established the Executive Office on Early Learning, or EOEL, it's because legislators understood how incredibly important a child's first years are to their success. The most rapid period of brain development occurs during the first 5 years. During this time, children are adapting, learning, and forming important connections at an increasingly rapid pace, which is unmatched to any other time in their lives. Investing in our youngest children is really a long-term relief package that addresses many of our social injustices. Access to high-quality early learning programs has been shown to reduce crime, reduce the poverty and educational gap, yields higher educational attainment, and prepares our future workforce. It all starts in the earliest years. Equally as important, it's also a short-term investment. Early care and education provides immediate support to Hawaii's workforce and is essential to economic recovery as it allows parents and caregivers to return to work and produces jobs that helps to stimulate our economy. In 2012, when the state legislature established EOEL, it's because you understood the need to invest in children during these earliest years. Many of you who are here today have understood and invested in our agency to coordinate and lead the state's efforts in early childhood. You recognize that young children deserved a greater focus and investment by state government. The state legislature tasked us with this charge when you created our agency in 2012. EOEL is tasked with coordination of the early care and education system from prenatal to kindergarten entry, and we work across state departments, organizations, and sectors toward a comprehensive and integrated early childhood system for our state. When we describe EOEL, we like to think of the agency as having two branches of functions that interact with each other. The first is to coordinate and improve the early childhood system as a whole. And the second is the administration of a direct care and education program, our EOEL public pre-kindergarten program. At this time, I'd like to provide just a little more depth for each of these functions. As coordinators for the early childhood system, we really play a critical role. As you know, the early childhood sector doesn't have a centralized authority. You can see on the slide that the many agencies, organizations, and programs that support our state's youngest children in health, education, and care. EOEL systems work helps to bring the community together to improve our overall services to Hawaii's young children and families. And we help to identify barriers as well as challenges and opportunities and successes that can be replicated. In addition to coordinating the system, which includes education and care, our agency also administers our own public pre-kindergarten program in the year before kindergarten. The program provides early care and learning at no cost to families. And our program is known as one of the highest ranking public pre-kindergarten programs in the nation, thanks to three main hallmarks: well-trained and well-supported educators, cost-efficient and effective use of public funds, and prioritization of at-risk and underserved children and families. With even greater investment in 2019 by the state legislature and clear charges for coordination and administration of our program, we began 2020 with high hopes. We remember that 2020 started with a spotlight on early childhood and the legislature's vision to give access to childcare and early learning to all of Hawaii's 3 and 4-year-olds. When the coronavirus arrived in Hawaii in March, everything changed. By the middle of the month, Governor Ige had announced a stay-at-home order. Schools and businesses were closed, and all non-essential businesses and activities had to stop. But some of the unsung heroes were childcare providers. Under that original stay-at-home order, childcare was deemed an essential business. Childcare is a necessity for working families, and it fulfills an essential role in Hawaii's economic recovery. The disruption to the childcare industry because of the pandemic highlighted the importance of childcare on a national, state, and local level, as millions of Americans are unable to work without access to safe and reliable childcare. Through the summer, the public pre-kindergarten program and EOEL planned our way forward. Throughout our planning, EOEL has prioritized face-to-face learning whenever safe and possible. The early childhood field is well aware that nothing takes the place of real-life relationships and a stimulating learning environment in order for young children to engage in meaningful learning, which promotes healthy and life-impacting development in all areas. In August, 85% of our public pre-kindergarten classrooms were largely open for in-person learning. Schools who began the year connecting with families online have worked towards in-person learning, and currently all of our classrooms have sustained efforts to safely provide these in-person opportunities for our students. Given this chaotic year, we've reflected on some of the biggest shifts as we've prepared our budget for the next biennium. One of the biggest developments for us this year had little to do with the pandemic. The state legislature forged ahead to codify its vision of providing access to childcare and early learning for all 3 and 4-year-olds. Over the summer, the state legislature passed House Bill 2543, which became Act 46. The law, as our legislative leaders intended, presents a vision for expansion specifically for 3 and 4-year-olds. In particular, the law creates a number of changes that impact EOEL. It transfers authority of the public pre-kindergarten classrooms on charter school campuses to the Hawaii State Public Charter School Commission. It also allows for expansion of the eligibility of preschool open door subsidies from the year before kindergarten to all 3 and 4-year-olds. There are also benchmarks for reaching full access for childcare and early learning for all 3 and 4-year-olds. And finally, the law establishes data sharing and reporting components to facilitate the larger visionary goals of the law. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic itself has changed the landscape of our sector significantly. As the state's coordinator, we tracked many of these changes so that we could mobilize to assist in policy and outreach. I'd like to share 4 of the biggest impacts of the pandemic on the childcare and early learning sector. First, to address changes in health and safety guidance, providers must have more staff available to provide adequate supervision. This is exacerbated by an already limited workforce pool that meets minimum requirements. Second, providers face longer days to ensure health and safety for staff and children with adjusted ratios and extra time for cleaning. Third, providers have had to take on more responsibilities to address the safety of students and staff, including sanitizing equipment and materials, which comes at a cost, while also having to deal with the shortage of supplies. Finally, providers have either chosen to reduce enrollment numbers or have had families who have chosen to disenroll their children, leaving even less income to continue operating. The shifts in the sector from the pandemic have impacted EOEL's work as well. On the system and community coordination side of things, we've had 3 main focuses in our response to COVID-19. First, with the support and direction of our board, we work to be an information hub for young children and their families, especially in the early days of the pandemic. Next, because the situation rapidly evolved, we convened and collaborated with stakeholders. Some of these efforts included working with stakeholders on understanding the need for and disseminating PPE and gathering feedback on impacts to operation across sectors. Finally, for our coordinator role, we work to maintain plans that will help us weather the pandemic and move us into a post-pandemic world. And of course, the pandemic impacted our public pre-kindergarten program and the way that we teach and care for our students once we reopened. The main changes included reduced capacity to ensure health and safety measures and health and safety precautions and protocols for both staff and children. In more specific practical terms, this means that there are now only 10 children per group each day, which is reduced down from 20. Our teachers spent time at the beginning of the year and throughout socializing 4-year-olds for masks, increased hand washing, physical distancing, as well as temperature and health screenings. We also made sure our classrooms and staff had adequate PPE and cleaning supplies to keep them and their students safe. And we were also sure to plan for the worst, preparing at-home packets for schools that needed to use the virtual learning model, which has happened in a very small number of classrooms. So as we look to plan the calendar, school and fiscal years ahead, we took stock of all of the lessons that we've learned and obstacles we still face so that we could plan to eventually move into a post-pandemic world. In this planning, we identified 4 main focuses: preserving existing childcare and early learning slots and programs so we don't lose the momentum that we've already gained. Continuing to plan for expansion when our state's financial situation improves, and starting to lay the collaborative groundwork so that when the financial picture looks brighter, we can coordinate across agencies to track the planning we've done. Finally, we underwent these analyses and took stock so that we could provide sound advice for efficient and effective use of public and private dollars as they become available. As we developed our budget, we prioritized one thing above everything else: minimizing to the greatest extent impacts to direct services for children and families, like our public pre-kindergarten program. In other words, young children and their families are number one. We understand the dire economic situation that we're in. We know that the legislature is faced with the difficult task of balancing a $4 billion budget shortfall. However, we know the trajectory will just get worse if cuts to investments in our youngest children and their families are made. When we talk about economic recovery and even economic development, early learning programs must be a part of those plans, as those programs support the current workforce by providing jobs and allowing families to sustain jobs and financial security, as well as our future workforce. Moreover, investing in the earliest years can help improve outcomes for our children, ultimately reducing costs to the state in later years. With this in mind, we put together this budget, which Governor has approved as a part of his package. You'll see a little over $1.3 million in reductions. These reductions include decreases in EOEL's operating costs, travel costs for staff and ELB members, and reductions to the charter school pre-K program. With respect to the charter schools, $775,000 was reduced. It's important to note that pursuant to Act 46, our House Bill 2543, the State Public Charter School Commission now has purview over charter school pre-K programs. As such, we're requesting that the remaining balance of about $3.2 million be transferred from EOEL to the Public Charter School Commission. Should this request be granted, our adjusted budget from general funds will be slightly over $5.7 million for a total of approximately $5.8 million. I'd like to break it down a little further for you. The budget on the previous slide currently funds 37 total EOEL public pre-kindergarten program classrooms, 18 charter school classrooms now under the authority of Charter School Commission with a pending request to transfer funds, and the positions needed to fulfill EOEL statutory responsibilities, including administration of the EOEL public pre-kindergarten classrooms. I'd also like to call out some of the items that are included in the budget that were appropriated by the 2019 state legislature through Act 276 or Senate Bill 78. That piece of legislation supported expansion efforts both in our program as well as in our coordinator role. The state legislature asked us to expand our program by 10 classrooms, all of which opened this school year. From the same bill, the state legislature also funded the necessary professional development and coaching supports offered through our Early Learning Academy and induction program. It included funds to transfer existing DOE public pre-kindergarten classrooms, not including SPED or Title I, to EOEL. The state legislature also made a commitment to maintain the existing 18 charter school public pre-kindergarten classrooms with $4 million of general funds, which replaced federal grant funds that were time limited. And finally, the 2019 state legislature invested in the EOEL systems coordination and public pre-kindergarten administration with an additional 6 positions that have been critical to our agency, especially through the pandemic. Only 4 of the positions required funding appropriations. We wanted to break out specifically the only things that could be seen as additional requests in our budget. It's important to note that these are not additional requests, but will allow us to keep continuing serving children and families at the same capacity that we have been. First, the appropriation for just under $250,000 restores funds for 7 classroom positions. They were cut last session because they appeared vacant on a report to the legislature. While the positions weren't filled with permanent hires, they were filled with warm bodies, and these classrooms had the capacity to serve up to 140 children. These are classroom positions, and therefore, even if vacant or showing up as vacant, we must have the position and the funding to open the classroom. Each classroom by law must have a teacher and an educational assistant. Restoring these funds ensures that we're able to continue with the 7 classrooms. And finally, we're asking for 2 permanent full-time teacher position counts. We don't need the funding attached to these. We're only asking for position counts. We've gone over a lot of history with so many changes happening just in the last year. But one thing I hope that you've seen is that the state legislature's investment, your investment, has been a long-running one. We've worked over the last 8 years to fulfill your vision for better coordination and expanded options for Hawaii's families, especially working class and underserved communities. Your investment has made a difference. We know it because we see it on the faces of our students and their families. We also see it in our systems coordination work, helping families afford care and supporting efforts to increase and improve the workforce. As you've all known, these investments will take time to mature, but the impact of your investment will be felt for generations to come. We thank you for these investments and hope that you can see what a difference they make, both short and long term, and how necessary they are to our state's economic recovery and development. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you, Director Moriguchi. Members, are there any questions for the Executive Office of Early Learning? Any questions? Okay, so I'll ask a question. Just to clarify, Director, you stated in one of your slides regarding your budget request that you're requesting $250,000 to be restored, which was cut from last year's fiscal cycle. You are not requesting that any of the funding that was cut in this year's proposal be restored. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And what will happen if, in fact, that funding is not restored, and also the positions that you're requesting in practical sense?
Sure. Just to clarify, the 7 positions were restored last session without funding. If the funding is not restored for those positions, there is a potential of having to close those classrooms, which could impact, I believe it was about 140 students.
So you would reach out to those families that are expecting to go to pre-kindergarten and let them know that their classes are going to be discontinued?
Yes, at this time we are sending out applications to families, and for the schools who have the potential of being impacted, meaning they may not be able to open up next school year, we are letting families know that being able to open up the classrooms is going to be dependent upon receiving the funds.
Okay, thank you. Members, any other questions? And thank you, Director Moriguchi, for the work that you and your team have done to get that program really to a world-class standard. As it was indicated, we have one of the strongest programs in the country, and that was based upon collaboration and everyone pitching in. So thank you for your leadership, Director. Okay, seeing no other inquiries, we will move on. Thank you, Director, to Hawaii Teacher Standards Board.
Thank you, Representative Woodson. I'll share my screen. Okay. Again, thank you, Chair Woodson and Vice Chair Capella, members of the committee. I'm Lynn Hammonds, Executive Director of the Hawaii Teacher Standards Board. First, I'd like to give you a brief overview about the board's work and then focus in on our budget. The HTSB is an independent agency that was established in 1996 by a grassroots effort of teachers, and administratively we are attached to the Department of Education. There are 11 members of the board who are nominated by the governor. That would be 6 teachers. One of those teachers must come from a charter school, 3 principals, 2 members of the public, and then 5 members of HTSB serve because of the positions that they hold. Superintendent, Board of Education Chair, UH Manoa College of Education Dean, the Native Hawaiian Education Council Chair, a representative from the Hawaii Association of Independent Schools, and also a new member, one non-voting student teacher member who comes from the public university teacher preparation system. And for just a moment, I'd like to introduce our chairperson, Brendan Kawazoy.
Hi, aloha Chair Woodson and the members of the Education Committee. My name is Brandon Kawazoy. I'm a counselor at Kaiser High School and a chairperson of the Hawaii Teacher Standards Board. And just on behalf of all the board members, we'd like to say thank you for all of your support, especially during this difficult time. And if there's anything you need from us, please don't hesitate to reach out. But just wanted to say thank you for everything.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thanks, Brendan. HTSB also has a small office. We have 8 staff and myself as executive director. We also have 4 specialists. Tracy Idika, who not only works with licensing, but also supports Hawaii's National Board certification candidates. We have Raymond Rodriguez, who works with licensing, plus the Model Code of Ethics for educators and statewide training. Sung T. Shu, who works with the Hawaii preparation programs, and Felicia Villalobos, who works with mainly with misconduct hearings, but effective May 1st, she will be our interim executive director as I will be retiring April 30th. We also have a secretary and 2 clerks, and that rounds out our 8-member staff. So basically what we do, I think all of the committee members have our 1-pagers, so I know you can review those and contact us if you have any questions. But our main statutory responsibilities are issuing licenses. So the board sets the standards and the requirements for 3 licenses, for 4 permits, and a new optional certificate for private school teachers. The board also approves Hawaii teacher preparation programs. Currently, there are 15 Hawaii-based educator preparation programs. We also administer reciprocity agreements with other jurisdictions, and that includes all of the other states plus the 5 territories. So when teachers are moving and hopefully coming to Hawaii to teach, our relationship with that reciprocity agreement enables them to easily obtain a license in Hawaii. We also conduct professional development that's related to the licensure standards and accomplished teaching. I mentioned National Board Certification and training in the Model Code of Ethics for educators. One of the interesting things that we do, that Felicia does especially, is hold disciplinary hearings due to educator misconduct. Last year, out of 211 reported cases, there resulted in 4 hearings. The board also sets its own budget, and we also support licensure compliance for the department, charter commission, charter schools by means of an audit 2 times a year, plus license renewal audit and a preparation program audit. So as I mentioned, we do issue licenses and permits. All public school teachers, so department and charter school teachers who teach 50% or more, must have a license or permit depending on where they are in their preparation process. And then the new private school certificate is under development in collaboration with the Hawaii Association of Independent Schools and their input. Sometimes we get a question, well, what is the value of a teaching license? We know that it verifies that individuals have been prepared, both in teaching pedagogy and that they have the appropriate dispositions to be in a classroom with students. A license also verifies that they meet the basic skills and the content knowledge requirements for what they're going to be teaching. And there are multiple options for both basic skills and content knowledge. A really important piece of licensure is that when a person goes through the licensure process, they are checked in a national database, a clearinghouse that verifies they have not had some kind of educator misconduct action in another jurisdiction, because most of the time those actions are not reported to the FBI fingerprint database. So that's how we also help protect children. And as I said, licensure also supports mobility across jurisdictions. This is something that I'm really proud of by our staff. When COVID hit, all of our staff, except for me, worked remotely, and we were just very lucky that we were able to do this. And as you can see, those numbers for 8 people, for 12,000 plus teachers, our staff responded to approximately 4,000 inquiries each. And what was really great was, if you look at the last entry, our customer service ratings from teachers went up from 70.5% to 80% in that time period. So because of our online licensing system, because our staff was able to process all of our applications online, we were able to meet the need of teachers throughout the pandemic, as well as maybe better than we were before. So now we can talk a little bit about funding. I just wanted to share with you some of the historical nature of funding of the Hawaii Teacher Standards Board. So the board, as I said, was established in 1996, and until 2010, we were special funded by the teacher license fees. And at that point in time, the fees were deducted from teachers' payroll for the department at the rate of $2 per pay period. At that time, charter school teachers did not have the payroll deduction. But we also had a small general fund for national board support when we were just getting started to help with stipends for that tuition. But in 2010, what happened is the HTSB deployed its online licensing system. And at that time, teachers were able to pay for their license fee directly to HTSB using the license system. So we were special funded all that time. In 2017, 2 of our specialist positions were transferred to the general fund. And that was mainly because of declining revenue from teacher licensing fees as the number of teachers gradually went down year over year. But a wonderful thing happened in 2019. Legislators from both houses came together and supported Act 116, which put all of the positions and all of the operational funds, operational expenses into the general fund. And as a result of that, the HTSB was able to discontinue collecting the license fee from teachers. And even though our license fee was low compared to a lot of professions, for teachers, they really appreciated that. They were very grateful for that, as we were. But what has happened is, since that funding was established in Act 116, not in the regular budget bill, we have not been included in the current Finance Committee budget. And so our budget certainly supports all the things we've talked about: the personnel, the licensing system, our website, which has helped us meet the needs of teachers throughout COVID. Of course, our office space, statewide support for teachers as they get their license, the preparation programs, professional development, national board support, presentations by our board to teachers across the state. So this is kind of a 3-year look at what our budget has looked like. So in fiscal year 2020, we had 6 staff and operations. In FY21, operation funding was the same, but we were able to add those 2 staff as a result of Act 116. And all of those positions are permanent and they are filled by awesome staff. But for FY22, those 2 staff that were put into the budget in 2017 are covered in the current budget, but nothing else. So, you know, even hopefully when we are put into the budget, we still do expect a significant reduction of about 25% for operational expenses. But for us, unlike maybe some of the other agencies, it isn't just some of our funding. As you can see, it's most of our funding. And, you know, so for us, this is a really significant and critical issue. So your question then probably would be, well, what would happen? Every jurisdiction has to license its teachers in public schools. So I tried to look at the positive side of it, the benefits of general funding. You know, the license fees for teachers would be covered if we're continued to be funded. Under the current HSTA DOE contract, the department pays for the license fee for tenured teachers. And I know at $500,000 annually, I can't speak for the department, but I would be guessing maybe they hope they don't have to pay that. It fully supports our licensing system, which has helped us to stay, you know, very current with our licensing applications, and to deploy really needed quality professional development, including national board certification and the Model Code of Ethics, and to provide guidance and accreditation support for our preparation programs to help prepare teachers to keep that pipeline going. So that's pretty much an overview of what we do and what's happening with our budget. So certainly we want to thank you for everything that you do to support us and the teachers, the keiki, and the schools, and to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Director Hammonds, and we're sorry that you're leaving us. We know Felicia, so we will also know that we will be in good hands, but you will be missed.
Oh,
and thank you for all the work that you do. You know, you have 8 team members and you guys do a tremendous amount of work. So thank you for all that.
Oh, our pleasure.
I guess you touched on my only inquiry, which was you said that for fiscal year 22, your budget is zeroed out. Again, the budget as it is currently standing is a starting point, but
Right.
what would happen if, in fact, that remained a zero? Would you have to revert back? Well, I'll leave it as an open question.
Okay. So first of all, we would have to reinstate the license fees. The real issue there would be that as the number of teachers have declined, of course, revenue to that former special fund also declined. So Representative Woodson, we've done all kinds of things over the years before we became general funded. At one time we had 14 staff. We reduced down to the 6 before we got the 2 additional. We have reduced our office space to 1/4 the size of what we had when we first started licensing teachers in 2003. We've done all kinds of cuts that we could think of. We're really trying to be fiscally responsible agency, and I think we did that. But we were just so grateful to get the general funding, not only so that we could do more and better work, but also for the teachers so that they didn't have to pay that license fee. They're all prepared professionals, and unfortunately at the lower end of the professional compensation scale. So we felt that was really a way to honor them, to be able to provide their license to them without them having to pay a fee. So not only would we have to reinstate the fee, but it could still mean a significant cut to our services.
Okay, something definitely to think about. Members, any other questions for the Hawaii Teacher Standards Board? Okay, seeing none, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on to Charter Schools Commission.
Thank you, Chair Woodson, Vice Chair Capella, and members of the committee. I am Yvonne Lau, the Interim Executive Director of the State Public Charter School Commission. I also have Interim Deputy Director PJ4 and Finance and Operations Director Danny Vasconcellos with us today. Although we had the opportunity to share with you our budget information to this committee earlier in the month, I'd like to explain that our public charter schools are like our department public schools in that they are public schools. No tuition, but limited only by the number of seats based on physical space for our brick and mortar schools. Public charter schools are governed by their individual governing boards, and their relationship with the Charter School Commission is governed by the charter school contract. The Commission is responsible for ensuring that our public charter schools are meeting the requirements of the charter contract, and public schools are authorized by the Charter School Commission and must meet the same state academic standards as our department public schools, but are allowed essentially to teach in their unique ways and methodologies. As state entities and public schools, there are still a number of compliance requirements that all of our public schools must meet. Public charter schools are structured differently from our department public schools, and their funding is calculated differently as well. EDN 600, which is the program funds for our public charter schools, and EDN 612, which is the program funds for the Charter School Commission, its office and staff, as well as our early learning program, is what I'll be talking about, highlighting today. For EDN 600, public charter school funding is tied to the funding for our department public schools. Unlike the DOE's weighted student formula, charter school funding is calculated essentially based on program IDs 100, 200, 300, and 400. And in a very simplistic way, they're combined and converted into a per pupil amount based on the number of enrolled students in our public charter schools. This is calculated on an annual basis, and the charter school per pupil is allocated 3 times during the school year. As such, reductions made to the Department of Education's budget have a direct impact on the funding for our public charter schools. This current school year's public charter school funding was originally totaled at $101.4 million, but as the department's budget was reduced, so has the public charter school's budget. The result has been approximately $5.8 million reduction for a total of $95.6 million, with still the potential for the governor to withhold the last 10% of the funding for our public charter schools this school year. Under the governor's original budget for the next biennium, public charter schools were seeing a further reduction from this year's $95.6 million to approximately $92 million for each of the next 2 years. It's important to note that of the $92 million, nearly $87 million is budgeted from the state general funds. Again, based on the reduction in funding from our department public schools, so goes the reduction for the charter schools. For the upcoming fiscal biennium, charter school lump sum per pupil funding has been reduced, like I said, from 101.4 to about $87 million. This represents approximately 14.2% reduction, or about $14.4 million. Using the current charter school enrollment of approximately 12,140 students, this would amount to a per pupil amount of $7,165, or more than a $700 reduction from the projected per pupil amount for this current school year. It should be noted that of the proposed $14.4 million reduction to charter school funding, about $2.8 million of that reduction is a result of reductions in the DOE's budget, specifically in program IDs 100, 200, 300, and 400. This is an example of how charter school funding is intrinsically tied and dependent on the DOE's budget. Any adjustments to those specific DOE program IDs will result in adjustments to the per pupil funding. So we are hopeful with the governor's announcement that the reductions would be reduced from 10% to 2.5%, that we would see perhaps some filling in of the gap in our per pupil funding. For EDN 612, the commission's budget was originally targeted to be reduced by $233,330, or a 15% reduction in our overall budget, along with the loss of 2 vacant positions. The one area that we did, again, want to advocate for was to continue our pre-K early learning classrooms that you heard earlier EOEL discuss. We did want to, as much as possible, maintain those classrooms, as we've worked really hard with the investment of the federal government through the pre-K grant to establish those programs. And although we had hoped that we would receive the $4 million that we had run that program on in previous years, the governor did allocate $2.9 million, and we're hoping that with this new budget proposal that we might be able to get some of that restored back up to the closer to the $4 million as well. While it's not ideal, our schools will make it work with, of course, the priority being to preserve the teaching staff. And with cuts, we'll have less that we had hoped to provide for the schools to support facilities maintenance, custodial and administrative support, utilities, and now with COVID-19, internet access and PPE costs. That's just something that I think we're all really concerned about. And although most of our schools have been on distance learning and transitioning gradually back to blended or in-person learning in some cases, the true cost of running school in a new post-COVID-19 environment is really a question mark. We're really concerned about what those costs will be in the future. So we're hoping that in addition to the additional ESSER II funds coming down from the federal government will also assist our schools in filling some of the budget gaps that they'll be experiencing if this budget is moved forward. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have, and we thank you for your support and continued consideration.
Okay, thank you, Executive Director. Members, are there any questions for charter schools? Representative Hashimoto.
Yeah, thanks for being here and presenting your budget. You know, I guess it deals a little bit with the budgetary issues, but I'm wondering if you might want to comment on some of the concerns that's been, at least in my community, about the approval of new charter schools and the difficulty of going through the process that's been set out by the charter schools. I guess, is there any explanation that you can give to us that it's a normal process, or it's been a little bit rocky? I guess I just want to understand, because at the end of the day, it takes
Sure.
time, right? Time is money, and it truly impacts your budget. It impacts the size
Right.
of the charter schools. So I'd like to kind of understand what's going on there.
Sure. So we did, we released an RFP that's part of our mission, to authorize new charter schools. And unfortunately, almost right after we released the RFP, the COVID-19 emergency hit. And so that whole process kind of threw a monkey wrench into our normal process. And, with the governor's executive memos and our state financial situation, we were basically advised to stop the process, and that we should not be moving forward with that process. And so the commissioners basically suspended the RFP at this time until such time the state's financial condition improves. And I think our colleagues at the Budget and Finance Office did explain that, and we know this too, that although, authorizing new schools is the commission's mission, it doesn't come at a zero cost. So every time we open up a school, there is additional cost, and the state does incur additional expenses. So until such time the state budget allows for that, the commission will be, has suspended that process. And unfortunately, with the way that COVID-19 hit, and we really didn't know whether this was going to be a short emergency and now we've now almost hit a year. We really have no idea when this situation is going to turn around. So the whole education landscape has really changed. So again, I think it's just something that it was an unfortunate thing that occurred. Authorizing charter schools is not by any means an easy process. There's a lot of, like you said, a lot of effort goes into reviewing those applications, and applicants put in a lot of time writing those applications. So, the commission takes into account the model that they're proposing, the community that they're proposing it in, whether or not, we want to make sure that we are working within our communities that we make the best decision for our state. Unlike many of our colleagues on the mainland, where they open and close a lot of charter schools. And it's really sort of a market theory, if you will, of authorizing schools. It's very difficult in Hawaii to do that. Cost of facilities has just been an ongoing thing. So the commission takes its charge very seriously. They want to make sure that when they make a decision to authorize a new school, that it's done very well, and that it's done with community input, and that it meets a need that isn't being filled. And we certainly don't want to duplicate, a department public school. That's not what we're here for. So it is a complicated process. It is, it's not something to be entered into lightly. So that's really.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your explanation for it. I think maybe, this concerns that we're hearing, maybe it's just a matter of better communication. I think it's understandable of what you're going through. I think, we all understand the budget concerns when we open up a new school. I think at a certain point, if you're right, it does take costs. But hopefully we can continue to stay transparent in terms of people knowing when things will happen, because the last thing we want is people to spin their wheels and end up frustrated, right?
Absolutely.
And so hopefully,
Absolutely.
we can move forward from there and improve a little bit.
Thank you.
Chair, if I can.
Go ahead, Rep. DeQuate.
On a positive note, Yvonne, I just wanted to say that, on Molokai Kualapu Charter, with everything through COVID, I can say that we've done fairly well, even with the COVID outbreaks, and Lydia has done an exceptional job.
Absolutely.
From you folks, when COVID went to lockdown, you folks were there to supply. She did whatever she could with her budget, and then leverage funds that she did have. So I just wanted to thank you guys for all you guys do. And for the future coming, challenges are going to be very hard. But she's there to also support anybody else that's looking towards charter. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Decoy and Hashimoto. Members, are there any other questions for the Charter School Commission? Any other questions? Okay, I have a quick question. Thank you, Executive Director, for being here. You are saying that you're projecting a per pupil expenditure of, you said 7,165. Again, that's per student. That's down from about $7,900.
Right.
Just a quick caveat, I'd like to indicate that, so you have $7,900 per student, which is different than what we spend on our traditional schools. I'm just pointing it out that that's something that we actually needed to discuss. That has nothing to do with the Department of Education. That is, as it was prescribed earlier, articulated in statute, and so something, hopefully that's something that we can look at in the next coming years. That's my humble recommendation. My question, however, is that you say that that's about a $700 difference, but you also made mention of potential funding coming from ESSER 2. That's the latest round of COVID relief funding from the federal government. And also because of the recalculation due to Council of Revenue's new calculation because of the new economic outlook. And so have you done any math as to how much of that $700 can be absorbed because of those new revenue sources?
Chair, we are anxiously awaiting the department's calculations. We have not received, formal notification of the ESSER 2 funds. I believe there was something shared with the Board of Education last week that I think the total was about 8.9 million in ESSER 2 funds. But again, I think the department needs time, or they may have been working on figuring out how those funds can be expended. As you know, with federal funds, there's a lot of strings and a lot of details that have yet to be worked out. But we're hoping that if that is the case, that may help to alleviate the loss in the per pupil. And then again, we have not yet heard from the Budget and Finance or how the budget will be calculated if the cuts are lessened from 10 to 2.5. So we anxiously await that. We're very hopeful, we're cautiously optimistic that maybe we'll make up that gap from this past year's per pupil. But unfortunately, I don't have those numbers for you right now.
And what is the current student count across the state for students that attend charter schools?
It's for this year, it is 12,140 students.
Okay, so we can do some quick math. I assume I'm hearing that $9 million figure as it relates to ESSER 2 as well. So hopefully you'll be able to get most of that, and then that will help out with that $700 deficit per pupil.
Yes.
But thank you so much. Members, any other questions for charter schools? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to the Department of Education. Thank you, Executive Director. Thank you for your patience, Dr. Kishimoto.
Great. Chair Whitson, Vice Chair Capella.
Dr. Kishimoto, we're having some sort of interference.
We're switching headsets here.
Okay, thank you.
Aloha, Chair Whitson. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Fantastic. Aloha, Chair Whitson, Vice Chair Capella, and members of the House Committee on Education. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you our proposed operating budget for fiscal biennium 2021-23. I'm Christina Kishimoto, Superintendent of the Department of Education. With me, I do have my entire cabinet today, so that if there are programmatic questions, they can assist me in answering with more detail. I have Deputy Superintendent Phyllis Onubasami, Chief Financial Officer Brian Hallett, Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Curriculum and Instructional Design, Terry Ushijima, Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Facilities and Operations, Randy Tanaka, Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Information Technology Services, Brooke Connor, Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Strategy, Innovation, and Performance, Rodney Luke, Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Student Support Services, Heidi Armstrong, and Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Talent Management, Cindy Corvell. Today, I'm going to be sharing a high-level overview of the department's budget, starting with overview information to help set the proper context. This presentation is similar to our budget testimony, and we've included resources provided to House Finance at the end of the presentation that committee members will find helpful. On slide 3, the end of last school year and the start of this school year have been unlike anything we've experienced before at the Hawaii State Department of Education and all of the other partner agencies who have testified today. Leading during this crisis period has required tremendous effort, tenacity, and resilience to safeguard our core mission. I am deeply appreciative of the entire HIDOE team, from our school principals to our complex area superintendents, teachers, support staff members, partners, parents, and students. We've been intentional with an innovative approach to both the instructional and operation side of the department, modernizing our systems and processes to focus on increasing student achievement. While this health crisis highlighted areas needing improvement, I remain committed to leveraging this opportunity to continue to modernize, improve, and move the department into the future. Our student success remains our central why we teach, why we lead, and why we serve in public education. On slide 4, I provide an overview of some of our highlights of our demographics. To ensure our mission of equity, empowerment, and excellence in education for all students, it's important to understand who we serve. As you can see, our economic disadvantaged students now make up more than half of the students we serve in this state through public education. Our students with disabilities make up 13% of our student enrollment, which translates to a little more than 1 in 8 students receiving special education services. These demographics, among others, help inform the design of our school programs and our equity of access approach. If you go to the next slide, this slide will look familiar to you. It was also shared during our briefing on learning loss, a very great conversation we had just last week, and appreciate that opportunity to have that discourse. The work we have been doing has been highly disrupted by the pandemic. And so our typical accountability measures, such as test scores, in-person attendance, they needed to be temporarily and immediately redesigned to capture the factors impacting schooling today. We've had to look at performance and accountability in new ways and in new terms of looking at vulnerabilities that are either exacerbated by or are new due to the pandemic. For example, we have students who did not fit into our vulnerable student definition, but due to the pandemic impacts on their parents, food and housing securities, job securities, we now have more students in need. In October, the Board of Ed adopted the metrics to monitor and evaluate the department's plans for reopening schools during the 2021 school year and to monitor COVID impacts on our services. The department designed an interactive data dashboard to visually track, analyze, and display key COVID-related performance indicators. The dashboard includes data on more than a dozen metrics across 3 levels, statewide, by complex, and by school, including areas ranging from quarterly student grades and attendance to learning models and student access to devices. This online data dashboard will be updated continuously as we receive new information. It should be noted that the increased reliance on technology in new ways, such as ensuring connectivity, devices, and additional supports for students, adds to our ongoing costs created by the health pandemic. Many of these costs are still not defined and will continue to evolve. On slide 6, The new global health landscape has drastically impacted our day-to-day classroom and school design, and we've had to remain flexible and responsive as we transition to reopening our school campuses. In late September, the Department of Health came out with its reopening guidance for schools, designed by our state health experts to help us with decision-making related to reopening our school campuses. I give a deep mahalo to Dr. Kembo and Karen Ng, and as well as Director Libby Char and their entire team who continue to work hand in hand with us on a weekly basis. The school reopening plan outlines levels of community transition of COVID cases that would trigger certain learning models for schools to consider. As a department, we set statewide expectations around health and safety protocols, but we recognize that decisions about transitioning between learning models has to be done at the complex area level and school level because student needs are unique to their communities. Schools in complex areas are constantly monitoring the daily state case counts and are continuously planning for potential adjustments that prioritize the health and safety of our school community. The potential uptick in cases following the holidays has been taken into consideration in planning for third quarter learning models. Schools have been careful to plan for any transition to different stages in their reopening plans to avoid moving in and out of learning models. With the onset of the state's vaccination efforts, we have been preparing to vaccinate our employees, which will also help to inform our continuation of rolling out our school learning plans. The department's vaccination plan covers an estimated 44,000 employees and service providers, including our bus drivers, medical staff, after-school program providers, etc., serving and supporting public schools as frontline essential workers. We are cooperating with the State Department of Health to expedite and provide access to individuals willing to take the vaccine and certainly encouraging it. Verified Department of Education data has been submitted to the Department of Health, which recently informed us that it has begun pushing out a prioritized master list to vaccination sites. Timing will vary for employees based on availability. There are priority tiers that are certainly already impacting our vaccination plan. First, employees who are 75 years of age or older, regardless of work location. And then any employee who is younger than 75, but is a frontline essential worker at the school or complex level, including contractors and student teachers. Then the next tier within the DOE is any employee who's younger than 75 and is a frontline essential worker at state offices. With this context in mind, I'm going to ask CFO Brian Hallett to present the next few slides concerning our fiscal situation and related ability to deliver our work in providing quality education and supports to our Hawaii's keiki.
Thank you, Dr. Kay. Good afternoon, Chair Woodson and members of the Education Committee. Brian Hallett, CFO for the Department of Education. Looking at federal funds slide here, the budget briefing instructions ask us to identify programs that have lost or are at risk of losing federal funds. So we prepared this summary of where we stand. In light of the pandemic, we've been carefully monitoring targeted equity-based support for schools that are very fortunate that schools can continue to rely on several major recurring federal funded programs to supplement our state funded programs. This list shows the national level appropriation for title grants that we receive. At this time, based on the analysis we received from FFIS, the Federal Funds Information for States, for the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, the outlook for these sources is stable and predictable. In fact, the indications of the potential, there is an indication for potential for slight increases in the neighborhood of 1% from current year funding levels, which will help with inflation for expenses such as employee pay. These funds appropriated in federal fiscal year 21 will be allocated to the department for use next school year 21-22. And this list does not include the CARES funds, which will be reported on the next slide. So next slide, please. Okay, so although we've previously reported on the use of our emergency relief funds that we've received and provided updates along the way with each month, this is a brief recap and overview. The CARES Act, as you recall, was signed into law in March 2020, provided $13.2 billion in funding for the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, or ESSER Fund, to address impacts of COVID-19 on public schools. Hawaii received $43.3 million. You can see the uses that were prioritized on this slide, and there is a link to the monthly report that shows the status of spending against those funds. Next slide. I think of more interest currently or recently is in late December of last year with the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 being signed into law. It provided an additional $54.3 million for the ESSER funds. The allocation for the second round of ESSER funds for the department is $183,595,211. These funds are for all public schools, and you'll see a portion that will go to charter schools or intended to go to charter schools listed on the slide. It's important to note that these are one-time funds. Allowable uses now include mitigation of learning loss, preparing schools for reopening, and improving air quality in our public schools. This slide represents the recommendations the department had submitted to the Board of Education that were publicly posted 1 week in advance of their January 21st meeting, the January 21st Finance and Infrastructure meeting. At this point.
So just to add a little more information on where we are with the Board of Ed process, which is also critical, we're proposing to use this new round of federal relief funds to restore funding to our schools for operations and educational services, address learning loss, and address the additional needs that resulted from the pandemic. Our proposal was presented to the Board of Ed for approval last Thursday. If you tuned into the meeting, you heard there was quite a bit of testimony and discussion, but the board ultimately deferred action on the department's proposal to program these temporary federal funds, in part due to the announcement that the governor, by the announcement by Governor Ige that the DOE's program review reductions will be 2.5% instead of the initial 10%. That essentially would provide a $123 million give back to the DOE to help restore some of the school-based funds that are generating the need for a reduction in force. And so looking at those funds together with the federal relief funds, one set of funds, the governor's budget reflects permanent funds, and the federal relief funds reflects one-time funds. And so what we are proposing is to use the one-time funds for teacher differentials pilot that we're running this year, the health and safety, learning loss mitigation, summer learning, technology refreshers, and health and safety requirements. If you go to slide 12, let's talk about the DOE's budget process for a few minutes. This is, as you know, been a very different budget planning year. Because of the devastating projected cuts to the school and classroom levels, we've been providing information about programming and service impacts. Principal voice has been critical in this process, particularly as they both inform the internal decisions, but also provide families with information about the fiscal challenges at hand and what they will mean to their children. We engaged in an internal tri-level process to determine where reductions would be made, with core assumptions about protecting the teaching and learning infrastructure, including the design of our curriculum core. So there was a state level review, complex review, and school financial plans review. In addition, we created a budget program review subcommittee to help inform the state level review. I pulled together 3 subcommittees focused on, first, business function efficiencies, secondly, school level efficiencies, and third, instruction and equity. Each subcommittee had tri-level representation. We met weekly in October of 2020. The subcommittees identified essential functions to preserve as we face budget reductions. The subcommittee's recommendations were reviewed by tri-level leadership. I also sought feedback from various organizations externally, including the Hawaii Business Roundtable, the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, and education advocates across the state. I presented proposed budget operating budget with imposed 10% budget reductions to the Board of Ed on December 3rd, 2020. The Board of Ed approved the proposed operating budget. With the board adopted budget submitted to the executive office, the hard lift of preparing the organization for the massive cuts and changes have been underway. Cuts at this level have implications around staffing, programming schedules, and so forth. We will be undergoing impact planning throughout the spring semester. On January 21st, we presented the school financial plan impact to the Board of Ed, including staff reduction numbers by employee type for each school. I've begun the process to engage parents and community on our budget process as well. From next week through the month of March, we are holding community convenings in each district to discuss with parents the following topics: our DOE financial outlook, the status on our significant budget cuts, what we are requesting from the legislature, and to provide them another dedicated space to provide feedback to us about these difficult decisions and what they want to state are their priorities in terms of impact to their children. Assistant Superintendent Hallett will now speak to the potential budget cuts on the next slide. You will see that we stand to absorb over $400 million in cuts each year. And I would say that our operating core and mission of teaching and learning is at risk of major disruption unless we address some of these needs. He will also be speaking to the impact of some of the new developments. A.S. Hallett.
Thank you. So we're on slide 13. Now we know and appreciate that you've been hearing directly from your area schools about their financial challenges. In this slide, we want to help put some context onto what has been behind what you've been hearing about. As this past November and December, schools were developing their annual financial plans for the next school year, and they were factoring in the minus 10% program review reduction. So the executive biennium budget and financial plans contain three major impacts to our budget for next year. And these are causing significant shortfalls that will decimate our public school system. The major impacts are a $100.2 million non-recurring reduction that was imposed last session on the current fiscal year and that is being carried forward for fiscal year 22-23 as a recurring reduction. The next column, the program review reductions, this is the 10%, which totaled $164 million. This is what on Thursday morning, the governor indicated or announced that he would be reducing by $123 million and reducing that to $41 million. The next column is the yet to be confirmed labor savings adjustments for employees that we're estimating to be 128 million at the original percent that was discussed or announced months ago at about 9.23%. But this is subject to negotiation at the collective bargaining table. So this slide shows that when factoring in all of these FY21 reductions, the new program review reductions, the carryover of the non-recurring cuts, and the looming labor savings, that we're potentially facing a 22% reduction in state funding. Now, if we factor in what the governor announced last Thursday, we would still be looking at approximately a 15% reduction. But 22% is the magnitude of the reduction that we had been anticipating up until late last week. So to reiterate, the reductions that you may have been hearing about from your schools, was based only on the implementation at the program level of the 10% program review reduction. So schools and offices, we have not asked them to identify to date how we would implement the $100.2 million cut or the labor savings reductions. Next slide, slide 14. This provides a similar view, but the previous slide, it paints the picture of what we've been looking at for the past couple of months and the context around what you've been hearing. This new slide, slide 14, is an update to where we stand today, or what we're looking at today. So let's see, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of numbers are being tossed out. This slide is designed to outline 5 challenge areas the department is working to find solutions on. On the bookends of this chart, in the white boxes on either end, you'll see the current year shortfalls on the left and the new added costs for things such as learning loss and continued health and safety costs on the right side. The department is now proposing to use our ESSER 2 or the $183 million of one-time federal funds to help address these two bookended or white sections. It's pending BOE action, as mentioned during the previous slide, and is a slightly different plan than it had been previously shown. It's been modified based on updated information that emergency appropriations that the department was counting on for the current fiscal year are being removed off the table, and that we will need to dedicate some of that one-time federal funds to meet those expenses. In the center, the columns in blue, the first two especially, this is where we're really looking to partner with the legislature to find some remedies to help stabilize school operations. The takeaway is without restoring the $100.2 million here, we are destabilizing the department. We need our base budget restored, and it's very difficult to plan at the school level in particular with this size of cut and this level of uncertainty. As you've heard from your schools, they are making staffing decisions. We are adjusting staffing in anticipation of next year. That's a process that's already started based on the financial plans. So superintendent and the leadership team have been meeting with principals. They've been very clear about this disruption this budget process is causing on their schools. The reduction in force process, because of the notifications requirements, we have a tight timeline to plan for the upcoming fiscal year. So again, this is what schools need your help with. Slide.
If you could turn to slide 16, thank you. The National Council of State Legislators has had a good framework for over 2 decades that's clear about best practices in public education finances. It's a national best practice to develop an education budget that provides equity, stability, predictability, and adequacy. Hawaii's weighted student formula, which is HRS 302-A-1303, 0.5 and 0.6 is a strong example of equity. Students' differentiated learning needs are weighted, and funding support is differentiated based on those weights, such as special education, EL services, neighbor island, poverty. Our principals, CASs, and staff serve on a committee on weights, which is also statutorily required, and thus our education experts program input into that equity formula. It really is an outstanding design. Thanks to our legislators' foresight on this statute that's focused on equity. We have defined our legislative priorities around the other 3 best practice areas. So if you go to the next slide, I want to give you a quick summary of our legislative priorities for this year. The department believes access to quality public education must be protected for all students. Therefore, we're requesting that the legislature restore the $100.2 million to the HIDOE base budget that was eliminated this school year. The base budget provides stability and predictability that is at the heart of long-term planning for excellence. We are also requesting the ability to retain and maximize federal relief funds to stabilize public schools, particularly on the instructional side. We must address our students' instructional needs, particularly the learning loss and the achievement gap, and ensure that there are no lost generation of students because of the pandemic. Third, we're asking for changes to state law to provide fiscal predictability and reliability for public education. We've asked and have been working with legislators around a maintenance of effort bill, and we're pleased to see that both the House and the Senate have introduced HB 611 and SB 815 so that we can have these conversations. Legislative priorities for the 2021 session are focused around restoring and preserving funding for school operations and student support. The department will continue to work diligently to ensure its ability to meet its core mission of teaching and learning and sustaining essential functions and infrastructure to ensure student achievement even during these periods of economic decline. So we'll close on slide 18. I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to engage and provide information for our conversation today. And my cabinet and I are available to answer questions. Mahalo.
Thank you, Dr. Kishimoto. Arguably, you have the most challenging job in the entire state. So I thank you for your efforts thus far. And thank you also, CFO Hallett. You arguably have the second hardest job in the state. So thank you for that. Members, any questions? Starting off, members, any questions? Okay, I will start off just very quickly. Does someone have a question? Okay. Starting off very quickly, Dr. Kishimoto, you had mentioned that you have approximately 44,000 employees that actually need to be potentially vaccinated. Do you have a percentage of how many employees thus far have been vaccinated that want to be vaccinated?
So Chair Whitson, the vaccination of educators is part of Tier 1B for the state. And that tier hasn't started yet. It's scheduled to start at the end of February. That being said, though, some of our employees do fall into the health professionals and the over age 75. And so they have started to be vaccinated, and that group has gone through. So I don't know if Deputy Unabasami has an amount right now or percentage, but it's very small. It's the group that falls into those categories that cross into category 1A. Educators will start next at the end of February. Deputy?
So, yeah, hi. So thank you. So for the vaccination plan in January, the early part of January, we asked all employees and contractors who work closely with the department, but who may work for another organization like A+ or bus drivers and so forth, skilled nurses, if they were interested in being vaccinated. We had over 18,000 people in the first round tell us that they wanted to be vaccinated. We then put them into the priorities that superintendent shared, and we submitted that to DOH. And so it's about 18,000. And our premise is going to be that with the fear of vaccination and what does it mean, I want to see what other people go through before I say yes. We have told DOH that we will keep a rolling survey so that people who may delay a willingness and want to come in later, that we would be able to get them also on the list. So right now it's at 18,000, but it could grow over time.
Thank you so much. Members, any questions? I have a question from Vice Chair Capella.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to everyone who is here. It's wonderful to be able to understand more about your budgets and the crisis that we're facing. I have a question in relation to the governor's GEAR funding. So how has the governor's GEAR funding been allocated, and how much is remaining? And is the GEAR's funding being used for innovation grants?
So I'm going to have A.S. Hallett answer that for us. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. So the current status on the $4 million of the approximate $10 million that the governor received in GEAR funds that was set aside for public schools. A good amount also went to the university to help with online learning, but the $4 million that's been set aside, the intention is to distribute it for innovation grants to the complex area level. I believe with the grant amount ranging between 100 and 600,000. We are awaiting the establishment of an administrator, a grant administrator for that. I believe the governor's office is in discussion with RCUH, and that we expect at some point soon that criteria for grant applications will be released, and our complex areas will be able to pursue those funds.
Thank you. And then, Chair, I have one more question as well, if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you. My second question is about also about funding. And At the BOE last week, you had said that you wanted to use temporary funds or relief funds for temporary needs like tutors and PPE. And then you also said that again today during your presentation. And then permanent funds would be used more to help prevent potential pay cuts. The governor recently announced that the DOE would receive an additional 123 million, and then taking the DOE, and that would then take the DOE's budget shortfall down to 141 million in order to help avoid pay cuts. This is kind of a large question, but can you today commit to the legislature that one of your top priorities is avoiding these pay cuts? We can call them labor savings or furloughs, but at the end of the day, they are pay cuts for teachers providing valuable information and learning opportunities to our students. So can you commit today to the legislature that this will be a top priority for the DOE to avoid pay cuts, and that you will use some of the stimulus funds to avoid these pay cuts if needed?
Vice Chair Capella, thank you for the question, a fair question. Again, I will reiterate, I am not interested in using temporary funds to keep teachers from being laid off, because then several months down the line, we will be issuing layoffs because those are temporary funds, right? We need permanent funds to keep our teachers. They're in permanent positions right now. So that's my ask to the legislature. The temporary funds, though, I'm sorry, the governor's funds are permanent funds. So that's what makes that so absolutely valuable to us right now. We have a set of priorities for those funds. One is ensuring that what is needed for health and safety at the schools is completely restored by the principals, and they can ensure that. Second, it's to make sure that the kids, the students are receiving the comprehensive instruction that they should be receiving, which means that puts money back into not only teachers, but also some of the other programming related to having that comprehensive programming by other staff members. The third is making sure that we are in compliance fully with IDEA for special education. And so that's not only teachers, so that's a commitment to some teachers and for the EAs that are needed for students to provide what are mandated services. And then the fourth priority for me is ensuring that students who are transitioning, especially our students in 12th grade and students going from 8th grade into high school, have fully funded their early college program so that they can get those early college credits, which is absolutely impacting more students graduating on time and going to college, but also the students who are seniors or going into their senior year are getting their comprehensive programming. So those are the highest priorities, and then we go from there. Off the top, I will also state that there are there's programming for at-risk students, such as our Olamana School, High Core, alternative ed programs. Those need to be restored off the top as we roll out these monies. Those are our highest priorities. So the highest priorities are centered around the students.
Thank you very much, Dr.
I'm sorry, and if I may just add, Vice Chair, related to your question, I don't want to forget to say that there's this other component that I cannot speak to, which is the labor negotiations that are happening right now that will have some kind of impact, and we're waiting to see what that's going to be. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Members, any other questions?
I have a question.
Representative Hashimoto.
Hi, Superintendent, thanks for being here. I think, I guess what is your can you explain to the committee what is the flexibility of your federal funds? So are you able to use it for whatever you choose to use it on? I know in other areas there are restrictions. I spoke with the university; they only can use it for PPE. So our DOE has much more flexibility then in the use.
Representative Hashimoto, thank you for the question. There's a lot of flexibility with these dollars, so we're happy about that. I'm going to have A.S. Hallett go through the categories for those dollars, because there's still some broad categories that we can use it for, such as learning loss, PPE, health and safety matters. We can use it for salaries. So I'm going to have him just go over those categories so you have those.
There are 15 categories laid out in the federal legislation. Rather than go through all, as I mentioned, addressing learning loss, preparing schools for reopening, and improving air quality are newly added categories of allowable use. One of the broadest uses of those 15 is one section called, it says, other activities that are necessary to maintain and operate the continuity of services in LEAs and to continue the employment of existing staff. But it goes, we also have mental health services, summer learning, purchasing of education technology, supplies for sanitation, and so on. So as mentioned, essentially, oftentimes with federal funds, there's a prohibition on supplanting general funds in the federal fund use. In this case, that is not the case, but it's clear the intention under the new funding that Congress just passed, they're focused or we're directing, encouraging the use for addressing learning loss, preparing schools for reopening, and improving air quality, which is why that was mentioned in the slide.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good. I think at least you have that flexibility. I guess, looking at your slide 10, I'm just wondering, how did you select paying the differentials out of the FY21 federal relief aid? I'm kind of finding it a little hard to find the nexus there. I guess, it's an important program to retain people, but I guess when you take a look at 21, how do you then sustain it in 22? Because I don't see it in the 22 column carrying over, and that's a pretty big chunk. That's $32.5 million, right? So I'm just wondering what is the plan for that?
That's a very good question. That is a current year expense that we are currently incurring for which we do not have an appropriation for. You'll recall last session, there was support for this. It went through 3 different committees, the legislation, and I think because of the pandemic and disruption to the legislative process in part and the scaling down of focus on bills, there was no appropriation. So it's a commitment that the department had made and it's been trying to fulfill for the first year and a half of a pilot program. And at this point, without without funds, state funds to continue this into next year, the pilot program would be winding down this year.
So the intention is for FY22, it'll wind down then?
Correct, without dedicated appropriated funds for that. It's been a successful pilot. I think it's had a very positive impact, but we don't have the means to continue a $32 million expense.
Right. I understand. Chair, can I ask one more question?
Go ahead.
I think this is just a broader question in terms of how are you keeping track of your vacancies in terms of, it's very complicated in my mind with the weighted student formula, because I think the schools have a lot of control over how to achieve that 10% reduction. What I'm concerned about is that a lot of schools are achieving that 10% reduction by just getting rid of positions. I don't really want to see us get rid of these people, because at some point I would assume it's somewhere in the contract, these people will just get bumped. So it's not like they're creating a vacancy in that, in the system. And maybe at that school, we're bumping them to another school because they're using a position to achieve that savings. I guess, how are you dealing with that? I think I would assume that you would want to see 10% programmatic reductions. I don't know if you want 10% in force as well, but is there anyone paying attention to that at the school level and helping these schools to make these decisions on how they're achieving that 10% reduction?
So Representative, that's a great question. We have a talent management approach. Our approach is to protect capacity that we have. So it's the individuals that provide that capacity, not the position, right? So if the position's vacant, we do have a hierarchy as we look at this of ensuring that we eliminate those vacancies and consider those before we're touching individuals. And we are looking at programming as well, except that the majority of our funds are in people, right, in the delivering of instruction. So I'm going to have Cindy Corvell, who's our Assistant Superintendent of Talent Management, talk about some of the supports that we're providing to schools as we go through this process with them, and went through this process at the school complex and state level in program and staffing considerations.
Thank you, Dr. Kishimoto, and to the members of the committee. We do look at vacancies regularly, and we look at projected vacancies as well. So we've been keeping a really close eye on retirements and resignations this year, and they've kept pace with past years. You know, we're concerned about with the COVID pandemic with having less substitute teachers, and so we created some pipelines to certify more substitute teachers. We fortunately have great people in our midst in the Department of Ed who have stuck with us, and we're not seeing signs of a mass exodus. We do look at vacancies. Today, out of our 24,429 salaried employees, we have 1,700 vacancies. Now that goes up and down based on, you know, turnover of people, but we keep a close eye. What we've done with the, we did the state level 10% and then the complex and school level 10%. The principals were given some guardrails, but really their school is their school. So they chose their reductions of the positions. Some are vacant, some are not, but based on their school design and what their needs were. So this funds that it looks like the governor is going to, you know, that reduction from 10 to 2.5% will allow the schools to bring back some of these positions within what Superintendent Kishimoto just said, the health and safety, the guidelines about what we really have to make sure is protected for the students. I hope that answers your question, but certainly we do look at vacancies, and we always, questions been asked to me, are you going to stop recruiting, especially teachers? And we said, absolutely not.
Right, and I think that's the point, right? I think it's, I think people, I think when you talk to teachers, they're worried. You know, one of my siblings is in the system right now. She said, she's fairly new. She said, am I going to get laid off? I said, I hope not, because they really need teachers, right? So I think it's a question, it's probably a clarifying statement to make to a lot of these, you know, teachers, saying you'll find a place within the system. I think there's enough capacity. It's just a matter, it may not be at that school, right? But I think it's sometimes principals get siloed into thinking only about their school, but I think there's a broader system we have to take a look at. And I think there was some frustration in speaking with, you know, some people on Maui about just how this 10% reduction was dealt with. I think they just thought, okay, we just got to cut. And I know it was severe, but I feel like part of it was there was some lack of direction and guidelines. So I just wanted to pass that along to you. I know it's not a fun time to be budgeting, but I think there is a lot of stress out there on how we're going to deal with this. But hopefully we'll get through it. I think this reduction of the cut from the governor will help a little bit. But I think we need to just continue to assure the frontline people that we're trying our best to figure it out, right, in the best way possible to make with the least amount of impact. So thank you, Chair.
I hit two wrong buttons. I thought I lost you there. Apologies. Thank you, Representative. Members, any other questions? Okay, I have a couple of questions. This is for Dr. Kishimoto or CFO Hallett. You mentioned earlier that you have a tri-level vertical communication structure in which you're having conversations about budget and how it's going to potentially impact the schools. At the school level, you said that the discussions that have been had thus far have not included the $100 million that was cut last fiscal year. And so what is your thoughts on how those conversations are going to go once you go back and say that you might need to potentially cut more? I mean, what's your sense? Do the schools understand that you might be approaching them again and asking for further cuts potentially?
This is Brian Hallett. We've had numerous conversations and communications with at all three levels of the organization to try to make it as clear as possible the risk associated with the $100.2 million and the potential that we deeper cuts than what schools have already struggled to come up with plans for at the 10% level. So I believe the schools are aware, the majority of schools are aware of that potential, but that also is a reflection of our #1 priority on our legislative proposals is we're asking for help with setting aside that $100.2 million of base budget cuts that were never intended to be a recurring reduction, always intended to be a one-time stopgap measure for last year. I'm sorry, for this year, as communicated to last year's legislature.
And I'll just add, Representative or Chair Woodson, because I think it's important to know, even I have periodic meetings with all of my leadership levels, met with them again, all the principals across the state yesterday again, to talk about where we are with this week's discussions with the legislature, so that our principals can talk about school-based impacts with their local representatives, in the context of what we're talking about in terms of the statewide impact on the organization. The board also, as we've met with them back in December, agreed with the proposal I put in front of them to have the budget process include the 10% cut process at the school level, not to be exacerbated to the level of also considering the additional 100.2 million, feeling strongly from the Board of Ed perspective, and they've stated their legislative priorities as well, of the ask to restore that base budget. In the middle of a pandemic, the legislature took money away from kids from the base budget. That's essentially what happened. And it happened very late. It happened after we had rolled out our plans for how we were rolling out the school year. So the school year had started. We were 1 quarter into the school year when we were notified that our base budget was cut by 100 million. And we were told that was going to be temporary. And so we worked with our principals to figure out how to cut that as a temporary cut, how to take it and put a plan together and present it to the board. So the board was aware that this is a one-time cut. But then we were notified later that this was a permanent cut. And so we've essentially had almost no time to go back with the schools to say, well, instead of the 10% cut, we're going to add an additional 100 million, which basically doubles the cut against them. And you can see that the school-based financial plans are already show a devastating impact just at the 10% level. And rather than going in that much deeper, we really do need to have the conversation with the legislature about what's possible before essentially telling our employees that our school system is being decimated. We need more answers. And so we got some of those answers with the governor's action on changing his executive budget, and we appreciate that. And we've got another set of answers with the federal relief funds that did come in since that time as well. And so we're getting some of those answers. What we're up against, Chair, is also when notifications are required by our labor contracts. And so, as soon as next week, we need to start notifying teachers in order for them to be part of this process of applying for other positions if they're losing their position in their school. And so there's this upheaval that's really that is interrupting instruction right now, and we don't want that to happen. So we're trying to create confidence and hope amongst our employees that we're working this out as we're trying to keep them focused on instruction. And we're also working with the HSTA, who continues to be great partners around this, on thinking about how we reset timelines around the transfer period for teachers and when that occurs. So we're in conversations with them right now, because we don't want teachers notified next week that they are losing their positions at their school and having to go through this flurry of moving around or applying for other positions, and then a few weeks later told, oh no, you have your funding back, and then asking to come back to their school position. Way too much interruption, and we don't want students' learning interrupted. So that's kind of the context by which we're trying to have these conversations and be careful how deeply we're going into planning for cuts at this time. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain that process.
Okay, thank you for that. Can we go back to, I'm going to say big picture. If we can go back to, I believe it was slide 14. The title was budget shortfall. Members, just for your edification, we're throwing out a lot of numbers there. So typically DOE's budget is about $1.79 billion. We're looking at an aggregate of about $392.9 million in cuts. That reflects 22% on the harsher scale and 15% cuts on the nicer scale. Both would be catastrophic. One is less catastrophic than the other. Thank you for this. And so again, keeping it big picture, you say that this represents numbers as of January the 25th. And so you have the first and the last column there that are reflected in white. That is an aggregate of about what, $174 million. I assume that's minus the 9 million that's needed to go towards charter schools. This reflects ESSER 2 funds. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
So far. Okay. So now you break out those two columns. You have $88.2 million. That's for health and learning loss. What is the $86.3 million allocated for?
Sorry, just pulling out my notes here. As previously discussed, teacher differentials 32.5. Second item, ongoing workers' compensation shortage, 9.5 million. Food service shortage, 24.9 million. Converged infrastructure, $5 million. Recurring annual costs associated with the cloud-based financial management system, 1.5 million. Unemployment insurance costs of 9.9 million. And health and safety, things like PPE and night security contracts, 3 million. That's what makes up the 86.3 million. Their current year shortfalls, needs for which we have no general fund budget to cover.
Okay, so you're looking at the $100.2 million loss, and that's from, again, the last fiscal year. The $164.3 million, that was back when we were looking at a 10% reduction. Again, because of the accounts on revenue services, that projection was upgraded. Thereby, we are now looking at a 2.5% loss, which reflects now $41 million. That's because we're adding back, as was indicated, $123 million. And so 100 million plus 41 and 128, that reflects 270, which you have there as the total shortfall. But I'm confused as to why that figure doesn't incorporate the $86.3 million, which is also to be added back to that total.
So that 270 million represents what we're referring to as a general fund shortfall. The 86.3 million and the 88.2 million in the bookending of this slide, that's what we're indicating that we believe we have federal funds that can meet those requirements. Of course, as we know, that's pending board action. As expressed earlier, the board considered this and deferred decision-making because of the new news about the governor's change to his financial plan.
Okay, so we're either looking at $270 million shortfall that we need to make up, or about a $184 million shortfall that we need to make up because of ESSER. So these ESSER 2 funds are one-time funds. We also know that some of the expenditures, some of the expenses are non-recurring. They're one-time funds. Do we have an idea as to moving forward what is going to be the aggregate average shortfall? And of course, we have to take into account, we're assuming a flat economic situation to where we're not having any growth. because theoretically, of course, as the economy gets better, then we can theoretically assume that the budget deficits will decrease. But assuming that our economic situation stays the same, it stays constant, what is the anticipated shortfall year over year?
Thank you, Chair, for that question. Much of what we have on this list for that to make up the $86.3 million is largely one-time in nature. There are exceptions, so it's a very good question you're asking. This is in the context of the budget preparations instructions that we received, and we were instructed not to ask for additional funds, that there would not be possible to consider additional funds. We did not submit requests for recurring general funded expenses new. But the workers' compensation, the 9.5 million, the 5 million for Converged Network, and the 1.5 million for the FMS management system, combined $16 million. That I expect those are very likely to be recurring expenses. Workers' compensation may go up and down, but the trend, that is an amount that we expect will be required in future years. I have to add, though, that the food service area, the major reason for the shortfall this year is the decline in the number of meals served. But we have been for several years headed towards a need for an adjustment to that budget of some sort. But at this point, it's too early to indicate what that would be. I think it would be relatively small in relation to the $24.9 million. But essentially $16 million for those three items I mentioned originally.
60 million.
16. 16. Work comp, Converged Network, and FMS. 9.5, 5, and 1.5 million.
Okay, thank you for that. So I guess I'm done with that slide. I also have another question. Members, are there any other questions? I will ask one question. And so also looking at the ESSER 2, the most recent funding that came out of the federal government, there is a maintenance of effort provision in that law that passed out of December. We are introducing a maintenance effort proposal as it relates to state finances. But Brian or Dr. K, can you speak about what that maintenance of effort provision says and how it might potentially impact our state budget?
Okay, thank you for that question. In the consolidated appropriation, in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, there were two sections that relate to have maintenance of effort implications. The first one is section 315, continued payments to employee, and it reads, the local education agency, state institutions of higher education, or other entities that receive funds provided under the heading Education Stabilization Fund shall, to the greatest extent practicable, continue to pay its employees and contractors during the period of any disruption or closure related to coronavirus. So that's the first of the two MOE sections. I think the second one is section 317. Essentially what that is saying is that the state shall provide assurances that such states will maintain support for elementary and secondary education and for higher education, in fiscal year 22, at least at the proportional level of such state support for elementary and secondary education and for higher education relative to such states' overall spending averaged over fiscal years 17, 18, 19. So essentially they're saying spending for fiscal year 22 proportionately should align with the average of spending for fiscal years 17, 18, and 19. I believe the intent there is to ensure that reductions are not made disproportionately against the education budget. I believe that was the intent behind that provision. And we can forward the text of this to the committee if you like.
Yes, please. That presents some interesting variables. Members, any other questions? Okay, if there are not any questions, I want to thank all the departments for presenting today. I hope that we have a better understanding of what we are dealing with as it relates to the budget. I would like to thank DOE for hanging in there and going last. Thank you, Dr. Kishimoto, for having your whole team available. I want to just quickly mention, so you have a very strong team. So we have A.S. Armstrong, who in the very recent past, has been masterful at getting funds funneled back into the Department of Education to the magnitudes of $100 million when looking at Medicaid reimbursements. We have A.S. Connor here also on the Zoom call. He has been terrific as it relates to helping our families with distance learning and making sure that they not only have devices, but internet connectivity. We have A.S. Hallett, who has been very thoughtful in figuring out how we distribute food, not only just to our DOE families, but to the larger community. That has had tremendous positive impact. And we hear that has had impact when we talk to our community members. Just to name a few, we've been on this call for a long time, but I wanted to thank you everyone for your efforts. And if there's no other questions or concerns or comments, we will be adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Adjourned.
Thank you.